Okay, I think we can get started. This is going to be the last session of the day, which is going to be on infrastructure. We're going to follow the same rules, 40 minutes for speakers with clarifying questions, 10 minutes for discussions, and 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. So, Amit, feel free.
Okay, so thanks to the organizers for putting this program on, this paper on the program. This is joint work with Kathryn Baragwanath, Gordon Hanson, Chen and Hogeun Park. Hogeun is actually a remote sensing specialist here at the World Bank. He's absolutely amazing. He was traveling today and was unable to be here. So this is paper, the title, it's pretty straightforward. We're going to use satellite imagery to detect the impact of new highways. It's a pretty concise paper. It draws on some work that Gordon and I have been working on for about a decade or so, and we've written a series of, I would say, methodological papers trying to take remote sensing images and trying to convert them into objects that we could study from the perspective of economics. And then it wasn't until this paper that we finally kind of put out an application. And so here it is. I would also say that this is not a trade paper. I have recently become a colleague of Costas, and Costas has convinced me that trade is just a small subset of a larger spatial literature, and so that's a sort of a double thanks for putting this on a trade program. Okay, so all of you are probably familiar with the large-scale infrastructure investments that are occurring globally. China's Belt Road Initiative is probably the most famous example of this. But by some accounts, like 1/5 of World Bank's lending is to transport infrastructure investments. We're going to be looking at India in this context, and in particular, we're going to be doing a backwards-looking study looking at India's upgrades in the 1990s and 2000s. During that time, they built about 6,000 kilometers of new highways, which includes the Golden Quadrilateral. But also 20,000 kilometers of kind of minor roads that were upgraded into national highways or state-level highways. And it appears that, if anyone has gone to India recently, you'll know that it's very evident that there's a rapid acceleration of India's investments in infrastructure and in highways in particular. And so by some estimates, this is from The Economist last year, India is adding 10,000 kilometers of highways each year at the moment. And so, it's obviously important that we want to try to understand the impacts of these large-scale investments, often some of the largest investments that countries will make. But it's also kind of obvious that evaluating these investments can be tricky, particularly in data-scarce environments. And in particular so that if we actually think that these investments are coming into areas that actually may be underdeveloped, they may be underdeveloped, and if they're underdeveloped, the kind of record keeping and standard data sets that we might be using may not actually be capturing them, precisely because there's no economic activity or limited economic activity there. And so satellite imagery offers this chance to sort of potentially examine the impacts of these investments in a data consistent way, in a time consistent or over time. Okay. All right, so that's what we're going to do in this paper. So we're going to try to quantify the economic impacts of road construction from the 90s and 2000s using satellite imagery. And it's going to be in kind of a sequence of steps that I'm going to go through. There's a few advantages of trying to do this. So one is that the raw data and many of the process layers that various kinds of teams ranging from remote sensing specialists and geographers, but also now increasingly computer scientists are producing layers that are in the public domain. So the work that we're going to be doing here was all done on Google Earth Engine, and so anyone can access the layers that are in Google Earth Engine, both the very raw data that comes directly from the satellites, which are typically, the ones that we use were funded by NASA, but also process layers that have gone through peer review, often in science journals, and are now in the catalogs of Google Earth Engine. So that's kind of one benefit. A second benefit is that the data are obviously scalable. They're across the globe, but also over time. And so I think this is something that, will be evident looking across India and over time, this paper won't showcase, I think, the true power of that kind of scalability, in the sense that one could imagine looking at the impacts of road investments in India on Bangladesh, for instance. Okay, and so one thing that would be useful, and I'll kind of end here, is that it is advantageous in some settings to be able to use comparable units of analysis in different countries. And so if you instead are looking at administrative census data from India, administrative census data from Bangladesh, the timings may be different. The census may be, but if you're using a survey, the sampling structures may be different. The types of questions may be asked may be different. So comparability becomes more difficult. I think satellite imagery offers a path to complement some of those analysis. And then there is a very rapid amount of innovation in layers. It seems every year you can open up remote sensing journals and see that there's a new layer that is training on more ground truth data, producing more accurate layers. And so I think this is just a field that's an area that I think is kind of going to only increase in improvement in measurement. Okay, so so all of you are probably familiar with inferring economic activity from night lights data, where the intensity of luminosity within a pixel has been shown in some work now for about a decade, that luminosity is indicative of income per capita or economic activity. What we're going to be doing in this paper is not just using that piece of information, but also daytime satellite imagery. And I'll try to convince you that daytime satellite imagery offers this potential to go not only scalable, but also extremely granular. And so in particular, we're going to be trying to infer clusters of built-up pixels where the image has, the image states that there's a built-up structure on here. It doesn't tell you what it is, but it states that there's a built-up structure. And we're going to be using a clustering algorithm to kind of build up markets from clusters of built-up pixels. Okay, so we're going to be using a combination of daytime and nighttime satellite imagery to infer the number of markets in India, but also get an estimate of kind of the economic activity through the night lights emitting from those markets. We're going to complement that with a road digitization exercise where we took Indian highway maps from 1996 and 2011 and digitized them. It's easy to say this in one bullet point that we digitized it. There's an enormous amount of work that largely Hogeun undertook in order to do that digitization. And then in the third step, what we're going to do is we're going to use maybe the most basic quantitative spatial model to simply translate the kind of data from the satellite imagery into economic welfare. Okay, so there's not going to be really an advance here by any means, but all this is going to be doing is try to translate the markets that we identify from satellite imagery into an economically useful concept of economic welfare. And we're going to use that through the lens of a spatial model. There's going to be some limitations, and I'll be very precise on what I think is a key limitation of that exercise. Maybe it would be many of you are much more into that literature and may have other suggestions on how we can make some progress there. Okay, so then in the end, the contributions of this paper, it's sort of a proof of concept that we think that satellite imagery is promising for this kinds of evaluations of roads. And then one of the reasons that we focus on India and on the GQ, which is and the GQ in particular has been a heavily studied road investment already, is that it allows us to benchmark some results. Okay, so I actually think that maybe looking at the new highways, which could be possible with satellite imagery, because you do get almost real-time snapshots of images, would be more exciting. But we're going to look backwards. In part, we're looking backwards in order to sort of benchmark whether we think we're in the ballpark in what we're trying to do. Okay, so that's the main steps of the paper. Okay. All right, so to preview the findings, we're going to find that improved market access from roads is going to increase GDP by about 1.6%. And I'll try to show you that this seems kind of in the ballpark of other estimates that people have looked at with India's road networks. In particular, there's a paper by Salman Alder who actually uses nightlight data alone to do it. So it's very similar. He's going to work at a slightly more coarser level of unit of analysis in Indian districts and uses nightlights, only nightlights and not daytime imagery. His estimate is going to be about 0.8%. So we're about double that. We're still not exactly sure precisely where the difference is coming from. It's something we need to dig into, but we're kind of in the same ballpark. It could be sensitivity to certain parameter choices that we've made. But then, that's kind of the aggregate effects. This is a conference on uneven development, and so one of the things that we do kind of dig into is the impacts of the road networks across different markets. One of the things that I'm going to emphasize here is that the spatial resolution of daytime imagery allows us to identify 13,000 kind of very small markets in India, and these small markets could be kind of isolated, almost villages. But they could be different areas within New Delhi. And so what we can do is we can look at the impacts across 13,000 markets as opposed to, say, 600 districts, which is what another typical unit of analysis would be. And in particular, we're going to find that both the very smallest markets and the very largest markets seem to benefit the most from this. This is kind of a U-shaped pattern. But we're also going to show that there's a lot of variation happening in the impacts of welfares within districts. Okay, so if you take one of these Indian districts, it's not the case that they're all kind of moving up and down proportionally. There's just a lot of variation. Within districts, the total variance in welfare changes across the 13,000 markets that we're going to be studying, 40% of the variation is happening within districts as opposed to across districts, which we thought was pretty sizable. And then finally, one of the things that we will do as well is we can distinguish between the really big investment in the GQ and other national highways, but also smaller roads as well. And we're going to find that the GQ kind of disproportionately benefits larger roads, the national highways, larger markets, the national highways upgrades benefit smaller markets. Okay, so that gives you a preview of the main findings. One of the things that would be useful from feedback is whether there's other kind of impacts and statistics that we should be, or correlations that we should be trying to isolate. Okay, all right, so here's the roadmap. I'm going to show you how we're going to detect markets. Part of that relies on a previous paper that we did, so I'm going to briefly give you an overview of what we found, how we detected the markets in the previous paper, the road digitization exercise, go through the model estimation, and then the results. Okay, so we're going to be so there's many different layers that one could use. We're going to be using the MODIS layer, the moderate resolution imaging spectroradiometer layer. This is data across Earth that comes in 36 spectral bands, which are snapped on each pixel every 1 or 2 days. At a resolution, it's called a 0.5 kilometer resolution, but think of that as a quarter of a square mile in area. We're going to be using a layer that was created back in 2015, which effectively took the 36 spectral bands. It took a global database of ground truth images to say that on these images we see a built-up structure, on these images we don't. And it's going to use just a prediction algorithm to convert the 36 bands into a binary built-up, not built-up data field. And we are then going to take that layer, and then in the previous paper, which we put out in the Journal of Urban Economics, we took those pixels and tried to just simply cluster them to produce what we were going to call markets. And so in that paper, we chose a market to be just if we saw any pixel of that was built up or not. In this paper, we thought that the minimum pixel size of 1 was probably too extreme, so we're going to use a minimum pixels in a cluster that have to be built up, call that a market, is going to be 4, so that's a little bit over 1 square kilometer. Okay, so that gives you kind of the most granular resolution for what these markets could look like. So yeah.
And so when does it go back?
The MODIS.
The 0.5 resolution.
Yeah, that's a good question. This goes back. MODIS goes back to the mid-90s.
But at that resolution?
At that resolution, yeah. And then prior to the mid-90s, it was coarser. And I think now it may be even more. So there's, yeah. Okay, so then, so now imagine we've got clusters of 4 pixels, 4 built-up pixels. We call those markets. We might think that, you know, a cluster of activity here and here that's separated by a park are not actually 2 different markets. They might be one particular. They might be in the same market. And so we also thought about clustering clusters. Okay, so you can combine proximate clusters into what we would call what we called supermarkets, and you can define supermarkets as pairs of clusters in which the minimum distances between boundaries is either kind of less than 1 kilometer, less than 2 kilometers, less than 4 kilometers, or less than 8 kilometers. And so we're going to work at the 1 kilometer market, so we're not going to use these superclusters, but we can also redo the entire exercise using superclusters as well. Okay, so now we've got these clusters of clusters, and then just because we thought that there could be some more noise, there might be some peri-urban activity right beyond the market boundaries that we detect, at least in this paper, we added an extra 0.5 kilometer buffer around that. Okay, so that's the definition of a market in this context. Now, the issue with this, yeah?
So on the first cluster, what's the minimum distance between the built-up structures?
Yeah, the first cluster is 1 like if it's...
It needs to be adjacent.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Now the issue with daytime imagery is that it's nice to be able to identify the boundaries of markets, but it doesn't tell you anything about what's inside the market. Okay. Now if you have better ground truth data, you can imagine predicting the 36 spectral bands, and maybe you knew the values of economic activity. You can imagine doing a prediction exercise which converts the spectral bands directly into economic activity. That's not what we have or what we've done. So instead, what we did was within the boundary of the market that we identify, we simply overlay the nightlight luminosity of India in this case, and then clip the luminosity of the market by the boundary. Okay, so that's going to give us a number between 0 and 63, where 63 is top-coded, meaning that's like, you know, think about the center of Manhattan, and 0 is a completely rural area. Okay, so that's going to give us a measure of economic intensity within the pixel. Okay, so the daytime imagery is for the boundaries. The nighttime imagery is for the luminosity. Think about luminosity as a proxy for GDP, and I'm going to show you evidence that it can be used as a proxy for GDP. Okay. Okay. Now, one last thing that we're going to need for the model is that it turns out that we're going to need 1 year of population in order to translate the results we're going to have into economic welfare. I'll explain. You'll see that in one equation. We originally wrote the paper using Indian economic census data, where we tried to overlay India's economic census onto the markets that we identified, and then tried to partition people into those markets. We thought then, when we went back to revise this paper, that it would be better if we relied purely on publicly available data. And so there is a data source which gives you population figures at a spatial resolution of about 1 kilometer across the globe, called the gridded population of the world. And so we're going to use that data set to figure out the population within markets. But we're going to use it in one very specific way, and I actually think it's kind of second order. We could, you know, when I get there, I'll talk about it, how I think we could have just relied on purely satellite imagery alone and not have to deal with this. Okay. All right. So this is just coming from the previous paper. So let me show you. There's different methods of trying to identify these markets. I think the most natural ones that you would have seen would have been something like this, where you have the nightlight value, that's this DN value of above 60, and the top coding is 63. So that's basically, you know, think about the center of a city. This is Delhi. This is Ajmer, and so not Ajmer, sorry, Agra. And so you can see that if you have kind of a 1 kilometer buffer around it, it's like you pick out the center of Delhi, you pick out Ajmer, and kind of nothing in between. Now, one thing that you could do is say, I'm not going to define a market as, you know, a nightlight value of 60. I'm going to use some like a value half of that. We chose some arbitrary value, and then you start to see, you start to pick up the satellite cities around Delhi, but then you also start to see the bleeding of lights. Okay, so then the boundary of Delhi becomes harder to identify, but the trade-off is you pick up some other. When you get down to like the 10, then this starts to just look like everything, right? So this is probably not very informative, and maybe you want to use something in between. Now instead, if you use the boundaries of the daytime imagery, you get a lot more variation of really small markets. And so this is what the 1 kilometer markets look like. This is the buffering of 2 kilometers. This is the buffering of 4 kilometers. And then this is the buffering of the 8 kilometer markets. Okay, and I think depending on, it's a reasonable discussion even for this paper about whether we should be working at markets at this level of unit of analysis or this level of unit of analysis. And I think I don't think we have a really good sense yet of which one would be more appropriate. There's some obvious trade-offs of working with this level of aggregation versus this level of aggregation. What you're trying to pick up. Okay, so that's kind of a result from, or a set of results from the previous paper. What we also then did in the previous paper is we correlated the measures of market size with the inferred population that we tried to figure out from overlaying census data, knowing that you can't really accurately partition people into these really small markets because the census data is just much more coarse. But there is, as you might expect, there is a positive correlation there. There's also a positive correlation between the size of the market and the average nightlight value in the market. And so that's probably indicative of larger markets being, having more economic activity. There's a bunch of results in there about using Zipf's law to validate whether the number of markets and the size kind of fits a power law according to Zipf's law. And so we went through a bunch of checks to try to validate the modus measure. Okay. So here's just zooming in. So I'm just going to zoom into Ahmedabad. So let me go through this picture. This is, again, just documenting what the market definitions are. So the pink is what the administrative district would be for Ahmedabad. Okay, so that's there. And then central Ahmedabad is here. It's in the diagonal orange. The really small modus markets that we're going to be using here are these kind of small dots here, like anything that's really dark. 4 kilometer markets are going to be here. So think about these as being clusters of 1 kilometer markets that are within 4 kilometers of each other. And then there's also 8 kilometer markets. I don't have the 2 kilometer markets shown here. Okay, but this gives you a sense of the granularity that you could toggle between if you choose the 8 kilometer buffer, 4 kilometer buffer, or the 1 kilometer buffer. Okay, and then overlaid against that, there's the roadmap. Okay. All right, so here's some summary statistics. It's a lot of numbers. What I'll point out is, just in terms of numbers. So we're going to be working with roughly 13,000 1 kilometer markets in India. Again, we could have done it at this level, at the 2 kilometer level, the 4 kilometer level, or the 8 kilometer buffers. If you go to the 8 kilometer buffer, you get about 3,500 8 kilometer markets. To give you a sense of how Indian census treats this, India's census say that there's 6,000 towns. The towns are the urban part of India, with about 31% of India's population back in 2011. So that's the urbanization rate in India, according to the census. Our 1 kilometer markets, based on the previous paper that we wrote, when we overlaid the India census onto the 1 kilometer markets, we found about 29% of the markets, where the 8 kilometer markets have about 35% of the population. Okay, so we think that there's a pretty close overlap between kind of this measure of markets picking up where people are, or where the density of population is, because obviously there's people in other places. Okay. Okay, so this is one more result from the previous paper. So what this result is just showing you the average nightlight value for the 13,000 markets, ranging from area size. I lost the axis titles. So this is one square kilometer, 10 square kilometer, 100 square kilometers, and this is the average nightlight value, which is top coded at 63. And so there's like a lot. There is definitely a lot of heterogeneity, right? And there's noise for sure. We're picking up some 1 kilometer markets that are basically, it could be like a flare, like a power plant, just like that's what the satellite's picking up. That's why it's up here. It could just be no one, there's something built there, but no one actually ever turns a light on in that area, or like a piece of concrete. So there's definitely noise there. But in general, if you fit a curve to this, there's a positive relationship that you can't see the standard error bar, but it's actually a pretty tight standard error bar despite all the dots here because of densities. Yeah. Okay. All right. So that was just more on the validation. Okay. Now let me show one more piece of validation, which we take from 2001. It turns out that there are subnational GDP measures for Indian districts, for 370 Indian districts that we found. And so you can correlate those subnational measures of GDP with the nightlight value, because remember we're going to be trying to clip the nightlight value for each of these markets as the measure of economic activity. So if you do it for those 371 districts for which GDP was reported, you do see a positive correlation between the nightlight values and the GDP of the district. Okay, so I mean I think people are probably familiar with the set of literature by Vernon Henderson, Adam Storygard, and so forth, showing that and kind of convincingly, in my view, making the case that nightlights can proxy GDP. But here we're just doing it in the context of India. You can do both nightlights in terms of GDP, and then you can also do it for district population. Okay.
Amit, can I ask you something? So I'm wondering, especially when you go at very disaggregated level, whether there could be emergence of new markets. Like somehow you keep the number of markets constant, but the more disaggregated you go, the more likely it is to an extensive margin type of effect.
Yeah, so this is a great question. Okay, so in this paper and in the previous paper, we fixed the market. We fixed the market footprint. There's a challenge in trying to identify the market footprint itself changing over time. And the challenge is that you can imagine clustering it in 1 year, and then you cluster it, say, 15 years later. And then you've got to figure out if the market has increased or changed in some way, whether the two markets are actually the same. And obviously that's easier when the buffer is bigger. And so we thought about it, and we decided that it was going to take a lot more thought to think about how to deal with that. Now, one of the things that could be done, I suppose, is to fix the footprint, and then instead of doing the clustering in another year and then trying to match, you can imagine doing the clustering on the changes in the pixels. And so this is something we've just started to think about, whether that would be possible. So that's an issue. And so our solution, which was just kind of a quick fix, to be honest, was to add that 0.5 kilometer buffer with the presumption that markets are going to be expanding. But I think that's an open question, and I think that would be a fun area to work on, actually, to be honest. Or I mean, I shouldn't say that it's open in the literature. It's like open in for us. Like I'm sure maybe other people have figured this out. Okay. So digitizing, so now we've got our market definitions. And so just on this point, to be very clear, we're going to be fixing the market footprint, and then what's going to be varying is the nightlight intensity over time. Okay, so digitizing India's roads. So we're going to be looking at this 11, 12-year period when there's an expansion of the Golden Quadrilateral. It's roughly 6,000 kilometers of 4 or 6 lane expressways, which are either new or upgrades, but there's also minor roads that are being converted into national highways. There were no the digitized roads did not exist, and so what we did was we took road maps from 1996 and in 2001 and digitized them first through the help of outsourced part of the work to a particular company. On these roads, there's 5 types of highways, or 5 types of inner-city roads. There's the GQs, the national highways, what are called all-weather motorable roads, fair-weather roads, and then roads where some delays may occur. If you've traveled in India, you know about those roads in particular. We then had to, so you digitize these, but they don't always line up exactly. And so we had to perform a bunch of manual checks, and in particular, there would be instances where the roads on a particular segment don't align. Remember, you're just digitizing these from paper. And so what we opted to do was to use 2018 OpenStreetMaps as the ground source. Okay, so whatever of the 2 roads kind of aligned with 2018 OpenStreetMaps is then what we took as the corrected value. And so you can imagine that there's different kinds of issues that arise. Roads might kind of disappear. They existed in 96, but not later. The later 2011 road type may actually appear to have been downgraded, which would be unusual. And then, or other way around, they kind of begin and end, and they don't have a connecting road on either end, and then there's dangles. There's like roads that begin but then end into nothing. And so, so there's all these issues that arose. There's also a question about what road speeds, because we're going to say that travel times are going to change as a result of the road networks. And so we have to make some assumptions on what the speeds are. And so we just borrow from what people have done in the past, which I actually think is probably an overestimate, again, having traveled on the roads in India during this time. No one was ever going 60 miles an hour. But 60 miles an hour, 40 miles, so these are for the GQ, for the national highway, for the all roads, and so forth. There's going to be this last set of roads that we have to deal with, which is sometimes the road doesn't go directly into the market. And so we're going to have to make some assumption on, like, imagine a 1 kilometer market and the road's actually up here. We're going to have to make some assumption on what it takes to get from the market center to the road itself. We know the distance of what that is, and we have to make some assumption on what that speed is. And I think in the baseline we use it's about 2 kilometers on average, and so we make an assumption that it's 20 miles an hour to get to that road. No, that's the road speed to go from the center of the market to the road that we see. Yeah, Sebastian. Oh, no, I'm thinking about the markets that we detect. Yeah.
No, I know.
Oh.
I think I know what you do in the data.
Yeah.
Conceptually, you're thinking about these as labor markets or markets for goods, or how should I think about them, I guess?
Yeah, we're going to be thinking about them as labor markets. Yeah. Oh, this is a good question. We can come back to this. Maybe we were thinking there's other ways to think about it. Yeah. Okay, so this is what the roadmap would look like. And then this is what the digitized road looks like. The smaller roads that are all here are fainter. I don't know if you can see them. And so that just gives you an example of what was created. Here's a set of, here's the statistics that we recover from the digitization exercise. So here's the national highway roads that get upgraded. There's some anomalies here, like there's like a decrease in the motorable fair weather, which maybe is right, because maybe some of these get upgraded into these. So I don't know. It's not. It's a pretty good job, but it's not the same as if we were getting the roads now, because now most countries will produce digitized road networks because that's how they're designing them. Okay. All right. So the model and the estimation. How much time do I have?
So wait. So
Yeah.
for the highways, it's not a learning with satellite data. You just take the maps and
Yeah. That's also a good question about whether it could be done from OpenStreetMaps alone, for example, which is like public source. But that's a more recent phenomenon, not during the time that we looked at.
In principle, you
Oh yeah, in principle, I see what you're saying. Yes, in principle, you could do that.
remote sensing.
Yeah. So I don't know of a layer that has done it for India. We could have trained a layer that would be bespoke to this.
When you said like, oh, you get like
Yeah.
daily images, you could do this on the 10th.
You could do this in principle. You could do
But
this.
not like that, right? Like here, you wait for the road atlas.
Yes. So yes, correct. Good clarification question. What the other clarification question I should say is that this does not include rural roads, which has been the study of like Sam Asher's work, for instance.
7 minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, so let me just push on. So the model we're going to use kind of I think of it as a very standard spatial model. Regions are going to kind of vary in productivity, which is drawn from a Frechet. Workers are going to have idiosyncratic tastes for being in different locations, also drawn from a Frechet. That's going to generate an upward sloping labor supply curve. There's going to be symmetric trade costs. Workers are able to move across regions, but it's not going to be perfectly. I mean, that's one of the estimates is going to be whether we find perfectly frictionless mobility of people and balanced trade. As is known in this set of models, the spatial equilibrium can be kind of very nicely summarized by a system of labor supply or labor demand and labor supply system in changes, where kind of the changes in a particular region in the wages over time is going to be a function of the changes in market access, and the changes in the number of people in the region is also going to be a function of the market access, where these two elasticities are kind of the reduced form elasticities of underlying structural parameters. The two underlying structural parameters are the trade elasticity coming from here, and the inverse labor supply elasticity coming from the Frechet. Just to preview where we go, you can see here that we have a supply and demand equation. So we have two equations, and in principle two unknowns. What we do in this paper is we don't end up having two instruments. So a limitation of this paper is that we're just going to set the trade elasticity to a value that people have set it to in the past. Then once you do that, it kind of you're only estimating one of the curves, and we're going to estimate it using the approach that Ben has taken, which I'll get to in a moment, in some of this best work. Okay, so in principle, I mean, this would be good to get some comments on, but like we just don't have two instruments in this setting, so we're gonna fix the trade elasticity, and that will pin down the labor supply curve. Okay. Okay, so then, I guess a key part of this is how do you measure the market access term? You can see here that the market access term is, wage times level, some measure of kind of GDP, some measure of trade costs across locations. There's going to be this value of the trade elasticity, which, think of this as just -8. That's what we're going to set it to. And so where does the satellite imagery come into? The daytime images tell us the number of R and the boundary of R. The nighttime images is going to give us this. And then the road assumptions are going to give us, the speed assumptions to different markets are going to give us a tau. Okay, so that's how we're going to measure the market access time. Yeah?
For workers, there are no frictions to move at those regions? Or the road depends affect how...
There's no frictions to move across regions. Yeah, they have particular tastes to being in them, but there's no frictions. I mean, I guess you could correct me if I'm wrong, that you could interpret the labor supply as kind of an evidence of not having perfect mobility. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so that was this slide. So trying to map the data into the model. The daytime imagery determines the size and the number of markets. The nighttime imagery is going to proxy for either GDP in levels or GDP in changes. How do we do that? We're going to take the 326 Indian districts for which we have GDP data on. We're going to take the nightlights of those districts. That's both in 2011. I think it might be 2001. I can't remember. But we're going to run just a cross-sectional regression. We're going to find a correlation of 0.42. And so now, if we have the nightlight value and we have 0.42, then we have a proxy for the GDP. Okay, so that's how we're going to use the nightlight data. It's pretty straightforward. The iceberg trade costs are going to be measured, following some approaches that have been taken, where you convert the travel times into iceberg trade costs. There's this last issue of kind of the last mile to go from the center of the market to the road that it connects. We're going to assume that you travel on those connecting roads at a speed of 10, 20 miles an hour. Maybe that's too fast. We could change that. And so then, quite straightforwardly, the market access becomes just a function of night lights and the road times and this trade cost parameter theta, which we're going to be setting to 8. Okay. Okay, so now what's the estimation here? So I said, we need instruments to identify the parameters. We don't actually separately observe changes in wages and changes in population. So we're going to aggregate these two equations together. So you aggregate these two equations. So that the change in wages plus the changes in labor are going to be the changes in GDP. And then we're going to have a composite aggregate of the reduced form elasticities as a function, or kind of multiplied by the changes in market access. Oops, sorry. Okay, so this is going to be the main estimating equation in the paper. It's pretty straightforward. Think of this as GDP. Think of this as market access. This itself is, we have to deal with the endogeneity of this, so we're going to follow Ben's work and just use a kind of an engineering least cost route to have constructed these roads as the instrument. Given the time, I'm not going to say more beyond that. And so we can just run a regression of the changes in night lights scaled by this alpha on the change in market access instrumented using Ben's instrument. We're going to get a particular value of this delta of 0.46. That itself doesn't have much meaning because it's kind of a reduced form elasticity. But then once we set the trade elasticity at a value of 8, this pins down the labor supply elasticity of the inverse labor supply elasticity of 0.5. Okay, so the labor supply elasticity, going back to Roman, your question, it's 2. Okay, and then what we're going to do is, I'm running out of time, we're going to run counterfactuals under different trade costs. What are the counterfactuals? We're going to start from the current equal. Oh yeah.
So I was thinking more that the roads can also affect migration patterns.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I have to think about. Let's talk about that after this. Yeah, I don't think we have that in this framework. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to start from 2011, and then we're going to roll the economy back. We're going to roll the economy back, kind of removing the GQ, removing just the national highways, and look at other kind of different counterfactuals. Both, no roads are made, just the GQ is made, just the national highways is made, and so forth. Okay, so what do we get from? Oh, so there's this. All right, given the time, I'm just going to push for it. There's one small minor detail, but I'll skip it for now. Okay, so here's some headline results. So we're going to just rank our 13,000 markets in terms of size. With these are the largest 10 markets, and then the different quartiles, separating out the top 50. We're going to find that in general the roads benefited the really large countries more than the medium size. But the smallest markets do gain slightly more than the second quartile. Here's a picture of the country in terms of its welfare impacts across different markets. Let me zoom in particular on Delhi. So going back to Devakish's point, I actually don't know enough about Delhi's geography, but many of you will probably. So here's Delhi, here's Agra. This is Vrindavan, Mathura, I guess. So here you see the impact of kind of the big impact of the roads on the big urban center, but then all the satellite kind of towns that benefit as a result, and the buds on the right-hand side. So this is the impact of all road construction. We'll separate it out by highway and GQ in a moment. Yeah, Costas.
So you assume there's no mobility of labor?
Yeah. No.
It's 2.
It's 2. Yeah, that's what it is. That.
How does the welfare gains are different? There's no welfare. There must be other welfare organizations.
It's GDP, right?
Yeah, this is GDP.
Oh, the welfare was GDP, wasn't it?
It is GDP. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe in the same model, you may be able to compute it even without mobility, with the same math.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Trust the case.
I see. And that would be a useful way to. Okay.
Yeah, like no mobility versus
I see. Okay, that's good. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Okay, so here's the welfare impacts. So I should say this is GDP. The GDP impacts by highway type. Yeah, Ben.
So the heterogeneity here is purely
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah. So the model is playing a very basic role here. It's just translating that change in market access to yeah, correct. Which we thought was the right approach in this, but maybe, I don't know. Okay, so I guess the last thing I'll point out, and then I'm definitely out of time, the impacts of the roads, the national highways are larger on smaller markets than the GQ, and the impact of the GQ is really big for bigger roads, bigger markets. So there's this unevenness there. Yeah, I'll stop at that point. Okay, but some of these points that you've brought up on kind of doing this over time and doing this with more recent data and doing something perspective forward-looking might be possible with this data.
Thank you. Devaki?
Okay. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this excellent paper from which I learned about the use of a bunch of satellite data and a lot of applications that can be done in future with this kind of method that Amit and his co-authors propose. I will spend a very short time on summarizing the paper because I think Amit has done an excellent job, and I think my discussion is going to be kind of complementary. There are certain results in the paper that I think Amit didn't have time to go through, so I'll hopefully go through them a little bit more. So what does this paper do? It provides a framework for studying the aggregate and highly local effects of infrastructure investments, such as highway upgrades. And they do so by using very granular data from satellites that can shed lights on very small markets, which are much smaller than districts, province, or states that you can think of. And the way they do this is that they identify the boundaries of local markets using daytime satellite imagery. And while there's a huge explosion of papers that use nighttime satellite imagery to actually talk about the intensive margin of economic activity, I haven't seen much paper that actually make use of daytime satellite imagery to actually talk about boundaries of markets. So I thought that was a pretty novel thing that this paper, and of course the previous paper, does. And once you define this market using the daytime satellite imageries, then this paper uses night lights to define the intensive margin of economic activity. So by using the traditional luminosity measures that we are more familiar with, and then using this market access measures, we can talk about GDP and welfare. And I think the most important point of this paper is that this paper is showing everything using publicly available satellite data. So it has huge applications in environment and countries which are typically data poor, but where there's a large number of highway infrastructure investments that are happening currently. So the main findings of this paper is that these improved market access increased net present value of Indian GDP by about 1.6%, and this was driven almost entirely by the Golden Quadrilateral project. So the Golden Quadrilateral project benefited the largest markets, while the national highway upgrade benefited the smaller market, with both within and across district variations. So this is again important because a lot of the studies, there's a huge literature actually that has looked at the effect of Golden Quadrilateral, but at more conventional administrative boundaries. But this paper shows that there's actually a very big variation even within an administrative boundary such as district. So this is my first comment is actually about something which Amit didn't have time to talk about much. But this paper, as far as I know, is one of the first papers to disentangle the effects of the Golden Quadrilateral and the effect of national highways on welfare. So as I said, while there's a very big literature that looks at the effects of Golden Quadrilateral, I haven't seen much papers that actually contrast the effects of these two different types of highway investments. And why this is important, the Golden Quadrilateral is a massive highway project that actually connects the biggest centers of India. If you just look at it, it kind of spans like the whole of India's boundaries. But the national highways are actually connecting relatively smaller places compared to the Golden Quadrilateral. Now, the Golden Quadrilateral accounted for about just 1/5 of the new highway lines, created by road upgrades or new construction, but contributed to all of the increase in the net present value that you see in the paper. So my interest was actually what drives this difference. So actually in the paper, almost all of this is actually, I think, driven by the market access term. So because the golden quadrilateral by definition is connecting the bigger centers, they have more market access. So all of these gains are, that's why they're accruing because of the golden quadrilateral. But the national highways are actually connecting smaller places. So this is mostly driven by the market access effect. So by definition, they're having a little bit less impact. But the other thing I thought of, which was perhaps not discussed in the paper, is that is there also something about lane effects? Because the golden quadrilateral is like 2 to 6 lanes. They're big highways. The national highways are relatively smaller. So can we separate these two? I thought it is perhaps possible to even in this same paper to separate these two effects, because there could be a counterfactual where you can think of thinking of the construction of the national highway as the same way, 2 to 6 lanes, as the golden quadrilateral, and then seeing whether you can separate this market access effect from the lane effect, which I think could be interesting, because if this is all driven by remoteness, should we think of that there is not a lot of gain when we want to connect remote places? And that actually brings me to, again, another point that Amit didn't emphasize in this presentation too much, but this paper actually shows that although the expansion of the non-golden quadrilateral national highways increased GDP by about 0.63%, this gain was entirely offset by construction costs, leaving actually a small negative impact. So the other thought I had was that compared to the golden quadrilateral, the national highways are connecting relatively more, like maybe not completely rural, but relatively smaller places. And is it possible that here we might be missing some of the benefits because these smaller places have more agricultural activities? And if we include more data on agricultural outcomes that are available from satellites, such as normalized vegetation indexes and EVIs, can we, do you think these results will change? Will we actually be able to find that the non-golden quadrilateral national highways actually increased welfare? So then my third comment is actually about the timelines of constructions of the golden quadrilateral and the other national highways. So in the paper, there are two periods, right? There's a 1996, which is the pre-period, and 2011, that's the post-period. So one thing I was thinking about is I know this paper is not dynamic, but if the golden quadrilateral preceded the other national highway developments, is it possible that there was actually labor reallocation? Now this comes to a lot of the points that were raised in the room today. So if the golden quadrilateral affected labor mobility, and there is already some labor reallocation that had happened, I know you don't have it in the model, but if you add that in the model, so in that case, there could already be a population redistribution, and if some of these people actually move to some relatively remote places that are not so remote anymore because of the golden quadrilateral, does that dynamically change the expansion of, change the effect of the other highway upgrades that are happening? In other words, my question is, could there be a complementarity between these different types of highway expansions? My last and final comment is, I'm interested in whether this paper is actually doing something much more than what it is saying. So is there any type of aggregation bias that exists if we look at larger spatial units compared to smaller spatial units that this paper can actually help address, because you're already doing it? And by this, I don't mean heterogeneity. So there's a very clear discussion in the paper that about half of the welfare variation is actually happening within district. And so, of course, if you look at a big spatial unit, and there will be a lot of heterogeneity that this paper is capturing, and that contribution is well spelled out. But what I'm interested in understanding is that if we're even only looking at the aggregate effect, if we look at just the district level outcome, using nightlights or whatever, and then we aggregate from the markets that Amit and his co-authors have constructed to the district level and compute welfare and take their difference, is there any correlation with the district size? In other words, is there any aggregation bias if we are just interested in the aggregate outcome? So so I thought this is an exercise that it's possible to perhaps even do theoretically, but it was not clear to me because the market access term was not obvious. But I think numerically this can be done. And this could be important because the Golden Quadrilateral and the National Highway, they connect market with different sizes. And therefore, if there is some aggregation bias, we could... Okay, so maybe I'm out of time, so I don't have much more to say, but I think this was a paper that made very impressive use of both day and night satellite imagery to define market boundaries and measure GDP. And it has huge applications for many of even the work that is done in the World Bank, because we look at countries where there's not necessarily a lot of data available. I think that there's potential for more improvements in this line of work where you can think of combining nightlight with more NDVI or the satellite images for agricultural productivity, because then you can talk about not just the effects from urban, in the urban areas from highway expansion, but also the rural areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Devaki. Let's collect a few questions and then you can answer them jointly.
Take the census and administrative data and they divide it over geography using nightlight data. Isn't that going to create endogeneity for you?
Any more questions? Oh, Stephen.
So in a sort of macro, many macro papers have like a production function with a public capital component. I was wondering, is it possible to look to sort of convert some of your estimates for 1.6% increase in GDP into like a elasticity of output with respect to public capital?
Okay. One more.
So I was wondering what it actually means to decompose the effects of two road systems when, you know, the benefits from one will depend on the other. Are those benefits separable at all? Because you won't have the benefits of one road system without the other.
Okay. Thanks. These were great comments, particularly Devaki. Thanks. This point you're making about an implicit bias in how we're doing things, which will favor the big markets versus the small markets because we're not picking up agriculture, I think is a great comment. We actually haven't thought about that, so that's something we need to think about, and that could explain this kind of this set of results that we're seeing, where like and it wouldn't be that hard, I think, to overlay some controls, for instance, of NDVI and vegetation indexes. So this is great. The points about complementarity, which is related to Devashis's point. Yeah. So what we're doing here is we're just shutting it down, and I think we could actually show the complementarity by showing that the sum of having both is bigger than that, and I think maybe that's what you're looking for, and so we could highlight that. But we don't have a full dynamic model, but the point you're making about the sequencing is useful. The comment on lane effects I think is great as well. And then this last point you make is really interesting. We thought about it, but we didn't do it, which is to redo the entire exercise at the 4-kilometer level and at the 8-kilometer level, which would be like partially addressing the comments you make and just seeing how things look in that, and that might help us understand the biases that we're getting as well. So that would be super straightforward to do. Okay, Chala's point about the GPW. Yeah, your points are correct. So there are inferences, there are machine learning algorithms that are embedded in there, and that's a problem. That's why we originally used the census data. But to be clear, the way that this will affect our results is we need it for one thing, which is to go from, so you have a market, pick any market, and then you've got to change in all the other markets. We need to construct essentially a weighted average of those markets. And so those L's become the weights. So we chose the L's initially from census, then we chose it from GPW. I actually now think that we could just use the area size, which would be directly from the data ourselves. I actually don't think it would change that much, but it might just sidestep this issue. So that's a good comment. It's useful to know where people are worried about particular data sets, but yeah. The elasticity of kind of GDP to public capital, I never thought about it, so that's a great, I mean, I think what, I have to go back. So basically, we went through a bunch of World Bank documents to figure out the infrastructure costs of the different parts of the system. So we'd have to we kind of aggregated that, but if we unbundle that, and then we could actually try to do something related. And we would be able to like get particular road cost segments and look at the changes in market access and be able to link the two. I think it would be a very neat idea. Half formed in how I said it back to you, but yeah, okay. Yeah.
Great. I guess we can move to the next paper. Wait.
Yeah, I find it. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and for including our paper in the program. So this is a joint work with Joe Kaboski at the University of Notre Dame, Jianyu at Central Bank of Chile, and Lixia at New York University in Abu Dhabi. So you will see that our paper is closely related to Amit's work. We will also be looking at the impact of golden quadrilateral, but we will study the impact of roads together with the migration of labor across sectors. So developing countries face many challenges in development. One of them is the inadequate transportation infrastructure. So according to the UN 2021 report, 1 out of 3 people in rural areas of developing countries still doesn't have good access to the transportation, to the paved roads. And in many developing countries, agriculture is still the dominant economic activity, accounting for a large share of employment. And many individuals in the agriculture sector can be best categorized as subsistence or quasi-subsistence farmers, meaning that they consume most of what they produce. And these two problems, the poor road infrastructure and large subsistence agriculture sector, are not totally separate issues. So if an area is not connected to the external markets, then the people are compelled to produce necessities such as food by themselves. And that drives up the fraction of people in the agriculture sector. And in recent years, some developing countries like China and India have spent a significant amount of money in expanding their transportation network. They invest in nearly 4% of their annual GDP on inland transportation. But despite the significant investment in transportation network, the impact of better infrastructure on local businesses is not well understood. So according to the standard trade theory, a reduction in the trade cost will bring in competition and drive out the low productivity firms. So at equilibrium, we should see a decline in the number of businesses in newly connected areas. But development economists have long insisted that roads are essential for industrialization. So when roads reduce transportation costs, people can move out of the subsistence agriculture sector. And the flow of people out of agriculture can promote businesses' activities in industrial sector. So in this paper, we try to develop a theory that unifies these two ideas. So we will answer these two questions. So we will investigate the impact of roads on businesses because businesses are typically the indicator for private investment and job creation. And we will study the impact of roads to the extent that roads reduce the transportation cost associated with moving goods across regions. And we are especially interested in how structural transformation influence the impact of roads. So to address these two questions, we first develop a model that combines the standard theories in trade and structural transformation. So we have a two-sector model, and we follow the standard trade theory and assume free entry and monopolistic competition in the non-agriculture sector. And we take the idea from the structural transformation literature and assume that agriculture is a necessity good. So there are subsistence requirements for agricultural consumption, and we allow trade in agricultural sector. And using our model, we derive some testable predictions on the impact of trade, and we then evaluate those predictions in the context of China and India. So we will focus on the construction of Golden Quadrilateral in India and the national trunk highway system in China. So our model features two opposing channels that drive the impact of roads on businesses. So the first channel, which we call the Melitz channel, captures the pro-competitive effect of trade. So when there's the decline in the trade cost, firms face an increase in competition for resources, such as labor. And the increase in competition leads to a decline in the number of firms in the non-agriculture sector. But our model also features a second channel that links the structural transformation to the trade cost. So in our model, when there's the decline in the trade cost, people move out of the subsistence agriculture sector because now they have access to these cheaper agricultural inputs. And the flow of people out of agriculture sector increase the number of businesses in the non-agriculture. So the second channel has a very similar idea to the Lewis 1954 model, who first proposed that the flow of the transfer of labor out of a subsistence sector can promote the development in the industrial sector. So that's why we named the second channel the Lewis channel. And we also show that the Lewis channel will become stronger if the area has a bigger agriculture sector. So empirically, we find that highway expansion has different impacts in China and India. So in China, we find that the number of businesses increased after highway expansion, whereas in India, the number of businesses decreased. Right? So note that this doesn't contradict the conclusion in the first paper because we are not looking at the aggregate industrial output. So you will see that the decline in the number of businesses is actually driven by the exit of small firms. Right? So they have little impact on the aggregate output. And we also find that highway expansion has a different impact on the number of businesses across regions within each country. So our theory can help explain these seemingly contradictory results. So we show that in China, where the growth of businesses is stronger after highway expansion, the structural transformation force is also more pronounced. And in both countries, we find that the highway expansion leads to a greater increase in the number of firms if the area has a larger agricultural sector. So in our analysis, the structural transformation helps explain the variation in the impact of roads both within and across countries. So here is the plan of my talk. So let's move to the model. So we model a region within the country as a small open economy. And we consider the trade between the economy with the rest of the world. And we aggregate the rest of the world into a single supplier. And the rest of the world includes other regions in the country as well as other countries. And the interregional trade involves an iceberg trade cost, which we denote as the symbol tau. So it means that if the economy wants to sell 1 unit of output, it has to ship tau units of goods. And within each economy, there are two sectors, an agriculture sector and a non-agriculture sector. And we use the Armington assumption and assume that each agriculture sector produces a distinct variety of agricultural goods. And we follow the Melitz model and assume monopolistic competition in non-agricultural sector. And labor is the only factor of production in our model. So each economy is endowed with L bar units of labor, and which can be supplied freely to either agriculture or non-agriculture sector. So household utility depends on their consumption of agricultural goods and non-agricultural goods. So the agricultural consumption is described by this CES function, which depends on their consumption of locally produced agricultural goods, which is denoted by this symbol QA, as well as the agricultural goods purchased from the rest of the world, which we denote as the QA row. And because of the transportation cost, when households purchase QA row amount of agricultural goods from the rest of the world, what they actually consume is QA row divided by time. And the non-agricultural consumption is described by a CES function, which includes a continuum variety of non-agricultural goods produced by the local farms. So here we make a simplifying assumption that households do not purchase non-agricultural goods from the rest of the world. Now, relaxing this assumption will not change our qualitative results as long as the imports of non-agricultural goods are not very large. And the utility function also features a subsistence requirements for agricultural consumption, which we denote as A bar. And we will take the beta parameter, the preference weight on agricultural consumption, to be 0. Right? So the households will not value the agricultural consumption beyond the subsistence level. Yeah.
So is the main, so if I think of an Armington model, right, and then you decrease trade frictions, it's not immediately clear to me that labor would be freed up. So is it on the non-monetic preference side that comes in, that are only wants
Yeah.
to eat the same?
Yeah, you will see that, yeah, because the agricultural imports will become cheaper, so the people will substitute towards the imported agricultural goods. So the people required to produce the local agricultural goods will decrease. So that,
And there's no trade in agricultural goods across regions within the country?
we will not assume that the economy kind of exports agricultural goods. Yeah, that, again, that's a simplifying
So that's the key
assumption.
asymmetry of how a fall in Tau decreases labor in agriculture and expands the manufacturing. Like that's the key, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I was going to ask the same question. So that's the only force for structural transformation in the model right
Yeah,
now,
that's
just income effects.
Yeah, right now that's the only mechanism. Yeah. So we assume that the technology, production technology in the agriculture sector is linear in labor. And so the capital T denotes the agricultural productivity, and the L subscript A denotes the employment in the agriculture sector. And the assumptions of non-agricultural firms are the same as in the Melitz model. So there is a potential pool of entrants which can pay a fixed cost FE to enter the market. And upon entry, the firms will draw a labor productivity from a Pareto distribution. And the production requires a fixed cost F in the unit of labor. And the firms can also sell in the rest of the world by paying a fixed cost F row. And after paying the fixed cost, they will face a downward sloping constant elasticity demand. So this slide shows the optimality condition for the households and for the firms. So the optimal consumption of local agricultural goods is determined by the subsistence requirement and the relative price between the imported and local agricultural goods. So it's clear to see that the optimal consumption of local agricultural goods is an increasing function of the trade cost. So when the trade cost increases, the imported agricultural goods become more expensive. So people substitute towards the local agricultural goods. And on the phone side, we have the standard results that the prices will be a constant markup over the marginal cost. And because the marginal cost of selling to the external market is higher, the prices for exported goods are also higher. And we can use the zero profit condition to calculate the productivity thresholds that determine the producing and exporting firms. Oh, yeah. In our model, people have to consume some agricultural goods, so A bar cannot be zero. So what? Yeah. Oh yeah, we can talk more after the presentation. And at equilibrium, the agricultural employment is determined by the total consumption of local agricultural goods and the agricultural productivity. So since the QA is an increasing function of the trade cost, the agricultural employment is also increasing in tau. So this means that when we reduce the trade cost, the agricultural employment decreases. So more people will be working in the non-agricultural sector. That's why the falling trade costs lead to structural transformation out of agriculture in our model. And we can use the full employment condition to calculate the number of firms at equilibrium. So the number of firms will be equal to the aggregate labor supply in the non-agricultural sector divided by the average firm's labor demand. So the average labor supply in the non-agricultural sector is simply the difference between the total labor endowment and the number of people required to work in the agricultural sector. And we can use the productivity thresholds to calculate the average size of active firms at equilibrium. So changing the trade cost has two opposing effects on the number of firms in the non-agricultural sector. So first, the decline in trade cost will increase the aggregate labor supply in the non-agricultural sector because of the structural transformation. And second, the change in the trade cost also affects the labor demand. When there is the decline in the trade cost, the marginal cost of selling to the external market decreases. So the firms would like to increase their employment to produce more output. So there's the increase in the labor demand, which will have a negative impact on the number of firms in the non-agricultural sector. So to help our discussion later, so I will call the second channel the Melitz channel because it's already present in the Melitz model. And we will call the first channel the Lewis channel because it has a very similar idea as the idea first proposed in the Lewis 1954 model.
So I'm not sure about the role of the non-elasticity and the preferences because the way that you're setting up the markets is like I can either eat local agriculture or I get it exogenous from the rest of the world. So now if I decrease trade costs, it's as if it's like a unilateral trade organization. Like I'm letting in imports, so my price is going to go down and I'm going to produce less.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why I need the non-elasticity on top of that. Like like the tau goes down, and in manufacturing trade, it's bilateral, right? Like you can sell your stuff to others.
Yeah.
For agriculture, it's like it just hits the local economy that you can't sell anywhere.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I kind of agree, but yeah. Let me think more about it. But maybe we don't need that feature in our model. I kind of agree with what you said.
How do you generate such structural change? I think she's doing it.
The tau goes down, and that kills your local agriculture because you can import it, but you can't export it.
Yeah.
It depends on the elasticity of substitution.
It's,
The nice thing about
yes.
even if the elasticity of substitution is close to zero, you're still going to get her effect. Sure. But in your thing, you need it to be greater than 1.
Thank you for the clarification. Okay. So we can also show that the Lewis channel becomes stronger if the agriculture sector becomes bigger. So to see that, we can take a partial derivative of m, the number of firms, with respect to the trade cost. Right? So this partial derivative is proportional to the sum of two terms. Okay? So the first term reflects the Lewis channel, which depends negatively on the agricultural productivity in absolute values. And the second term reflects the Melitz channel, which depends positively on the agricultural productivity. So if you take the agricultural productivity to be infinity, so the agriculture sector becomes very small, then our model essentially reduced to the Melitz model. So only the Melitz channel exists. So the Melitz channel dominates. But if we reduce the agricultural productivity, then the agricultural sector becomes bigger. So the Lewis channel will dominate. So the structural transformation force will be stronger. So these slides summarize our model propositions. So first, in our model, the trade cost will affect the structural transformation out of agricultural sector. So if you lower the trade cost, more people will be working in the non-agricultural sector. And then the Melitz channel predicts that if the aggregate labor supply doesn't change, then a reduction in the trade cost will reduce the number of firms at equilibrium. And the Lewis channel predicts the opposite way. So if we increase the labor supply in the non-agricultural sector, holding fixed the firm's labor demand, then the number of firms will increase. And then finally, we can show that there exists a threshold in the agricultural employment, that above that threshold, the Lewis channel will dominate the Melitz channel.
Right. So one thing, so here the fixed cost is paid in terms of labor in the
yeah.
origin country. So I think one thing that we know about the Melitz model is that when it's paid in terms of labor in the destination country, with Pareto, then the number of firms is tied to the workers in the non-agricultural sector. Like the ratio of M to L becomes constant. So that seems like a big assumption here. Is there like, what I'm saying is that the Melitz prediction ultimately relies really on where the fixed cost is paid, whether it's in terms of labor in the destination country or in the origin country.
But I don't think it will predict an increase in the number of businesses, right?
It would just
So,
predict a constant,
yeah.
basically, number of firms as
Yeah.
a ratio of population.
Okay. So basically here we want to highlight that the Lewis channel will predict kind of the change in the number of firms differently from what the Melitz channel is saying. But yeah. Okay. So now let me talk about our empirical analysis. Like we want to evaluate those predictions in using the large highway expansions in the two developing countries, China and India. So just a little bit background about these two highway expansions. So the construction of Golden Quadrilateral started in 2001, and the goal of this highway was to connect the four major metropolitan areas, Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata. And the National Trunk Highway System was planned by the Chinese State Council, and the construction began in 1992. And its stated objective was to connect all provincial capitals and populous cities with the nation's capital. So here is a figure that shows the completed sections of Golden Quadrilateral in 2001, 2006. And here is another figure about China's National Trunk Highway System. So to estimate the impact of highway expansions, we use a diff-in-diff specification, treating the two countries as symmetrically as possible. We first define the post-completion period as the period in which at least 80% of the highway was completed. And then we exclude the targeted cities and the areas within 50 kilometers away from the target. And we then classify the remaining districts into terciles based on their distance to the actual highway. And we identify the connected districts as those in the first and the second terciles. And the beta coefficient in the regression equation is our parameter of interest, capturing the impact of highway on the outcome. So in addition to the standard fixed effects that account for the aggregate shocks and the district-specific shocks, we also include some time-varying district characteristics, such as the total population or total output in that districts, to account for the possibility that a bigger district or more economically developed districts are located closer to the highway. And the standard errors are clustered at the district level.
So what does it mean if you control for a district's GDP?
So basically, we are looking at like even with the same level of output, what happened to the number of forms? So if the number of form increase is mainly driven by the small forms.
That's different from the model prediction side.
So we will kind of do robustness checks with and without controlling for output, and you will see. So if we estimate the diff in diff using the OIS, the implicit assumption is that the highways were placed randomly among the non-targeted districts. But this assumption may be too strong, especially considering the recent evidence from Elder and Ilinin, who show that the top officials in China appear to able to shape the highway layout by moving their birthplaces, by moving the highway closer to their birthplaces. So to address the potential concern about the endogeneity, the endogenous placement of highways, so we follow the previous literature and use various measures to instrument the distance to the highway. So for India, we use the straight line IVs following these previous two papers, and the straight line IVs are the distance to the straight lines that connect the 4 targeted cities. And for China, we follow the Faber 2014 and construct a hypothetical least cost path spanning 3 networks. So these networks are the routes which are most likely chosen by the government if the government only care about cost minimization in connecting the targeted cities. So this figure shows the actual highway, the actual placement of golden quadrilateral, which are the red lines, and the straight line IVs that we use as an instrument. And this graph shows the hypothetical least cost path spanning 3 networks that we use as an instrument for China. So on the left is our own construction, and you can see that it looks almost the same as the one in the original paper. So in addition to the highway distance data, we also collect other data sets to measure the businesses' activities and agricultural employment in the local region. So for India, we use the annual survey of industries to measure the number of businesses in each district. So the ASI is the principal source of industrial statistics in India, and it covers all the industry units which are registered with the government under the Factories Act. And we use the national sample survey to measure the agricultural employment in each district. So the NSS is the longest running household survey in India, and it collects a variety of socioeconomic indicators at the individual and the household levels. So we use the individual level information about their labor market participation and aggregate the information to the district level. So that the NSS is not available every year. So for the missing years, we use the linear interpolation method to fill in the missing values. But our results are robust to using just the data from just these 5 years. And for China, all the data come from the Provincial Statistical Yearbook. So now let's look at our empirical results. So in this table, I show you the impact of highway expansion on the number of businesses. So the first 2 columns show the results about India. And we find a significant negative coefficient on the interaction terms, suggesting that the highway expansion has reduced the number of businesses in the connected areas in India. And the columns 4, 5, 6 show the results about China. And here we find that the coefficient on the interaction term change signs. So the results suggest that the highway expansion leads to an increase in the number of businesses in China. So if we interpret these results through the lens of our model, we would conclude that the Lewis channel dominates in China because the highway expansion leads to an increase in the number of businesses. And we would predict that Melitz channel dominates in India because the highway expansion reduced the number of businesses. And I will show you that our results are consistent with both of these predictions. So first, we find evidence of Lewis channel in China. Right? So in this table, I show you the impact of highway expansion on agricultural employment. And we find that agricultural employment decreased by almost 32 log points in the areas which become connected to the highway. And in India, where the growth of farms is weaker, we find that the Lewis channel is also weaker. Right? There is no significant change in agricultural employment after highway expansion in India.
Are these long differences, or is it annual data?
Annual data. But the results in China, the results in India are consistent with the Melitz channel. Right? So we know that the Melitz model predicts that the low productivity firms will exit the market when there's the decline in the trade cost. So first we look at the firms with different sizes. So in column 1, we are looking at the number of small firms which has fewer than 25 employees. And in column 3, we are looking at the number of large firms which have more than 500 employees. And we see that the highway expansion has reduced the number of small firms, but actually increased the number of large firms. We can also divide the firms by their productivity. So here we measure productivity using their value added per worker, and we find similar conclusions that the highway expansion reduced the number of low productivity firms, but without affecting the number of high productivity firms. And then finally, we will test the prediction that the Lewis channel dominates in areas with bigger agriculture sector. So to test this prediction, we divide all the districts into terciles based on their agricultural employment share at the beginning of our sample period. So the first 3 columns show the results about India. And we see that in the area with large agricultural employment share, the decline in the number of businesses becomes statistically insignificant, so suggesting that the Lewis channel becomes stronger in those areas. And the column 4, 5, 6 show the results about China. And again, we see that the growth of farms is stronger in the areas where there is a bigger agriculture sector. So overall, the results are largely consistent with our prediction that the Lewis channel becomes stronger when the area has a bigger agriculture sector. So to conclude, so in this paper, we study the impact of roads on businesses and structural transformation. And our model highlights this nuanced interaction between trade cost and structural transformation. So we show that without considering the structural transformation force, the Melitz channel would predict a decline in the number of firms when there's the decline in the trade cost. But if we take into consideration the structural transformation impact, now the decline in the trade cost could lead to an increase in the number of businesses. And we evaluate these predictions using the major highway expansions as our empirical changes in trade cost. And we find that our theory can reconcile these seemingly conflicting results in both countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jose?
Okay, cool. Okay, so first off, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the paper. I really enjoyed reading it, so thank you to the organizers of the conference for that. Usual disclaimers apply. These are just my opinions and not those of the U.S. Census Bureau. Okay, so Wade did a really nice job in presenting all the results of the paper, and so I'm just going to jump into my take of the paper. So I think there's a lot of nice things about the paper. So the first one is that one thing that's really cool about the paper is that it actually looks at two different countries, right? So it's looking at China, it's looking at India, and like a lot of the papers in the literature, they tend to focus on one country or they typically focus on one country. This one looks at two. I think that's interesting. The other thing, too, is that these are going to be large economies, and these are going to be economies that have invested significantly in infrastructure. So it was a big part of what China did, and if you look at, for example, Modi, as Amit mentioned, there's been huge investments in India, and it's a big part of the program that the government's big part of the development strategy. So I think it's really cool that they have two different countries. Now, I think what's cool about the paper in terms of both theoretically and empirically, so one is I think what I like about the paper is that in terms of the model is that they have a really, it's a simple model that makes a very clear point. And as far as I know, this is a novel point, and which is that if you lower the trade cost, you can potentially have different effects on the manufacturing sector. So you have the Melitz channel. So this is going to be, let's say you go talk to a trade economist and you ask him what happens if you lower trade costs. Typically, the way they think about it would be this Melitz channel, which is going to be that you have the efficient firms. They're going to expand in size because they're going to pay the fixed cost to export abroad. And then that's going to knock out some of the less efficient firms. So, that's like the 101 theory. And so what's going to happen there is that you're going to have more concentrations. You're going to have fewer firms, larger firms. So that's kind of how most trade economists would think about this issue. Now, the twist here is going to be that they're incorporating a new channel, which is the Lewis channel. And then here, this is going to be the opposite, because now there's labor in the agricultural sector. It's being released to the manufacturing sector. And in this case, you can actually have less firm concentration. So you'd have more firms, and you have smaller firms in the manufacturing sector. So I think it's nice. It's a nice model, and it makes this interesting point, which, by the way, is going to be relevant if you're thinking about the development context. So I think that's cool. And they also have the model gives you predictions in terms of which kind of effect is going to dominate. Is it the Melitz effect? Is it Lewis? And it's going to be based on the initial share of employment in agriculture. So that's really nice, this simple model, this point that they're making. And also just in terms of, again, this empirically, they're analyzing two different countries and thinking about the size of these effects. So those are going to be, that's my general take on the paper. In terms of some suggestions I have for the paper, the first suggestion is going to be, one thing that I found that I was wondering is, so what can account for the different effects that we're seeing in China versus India? So, if you look at the results, what we're finding is that the Melitz effect dominates in India, whereas the Lewis effect dominates in China. Now, if you take a step back and you say, okay, let's go back before we look at any of these results, and we say, okay, what do we expect the Melitz or the Lewis effect to dominate in China or in India? So if you look at the model, it's really going to be based on the initial share of employment in the agricultural sector. So you go to WDI, so you can actually download this data, right? So you go to WDI, and for the year 2000, I downloaded the data on what's the share of employment in the agricultural sector. So in China, it's going to be 50%. In India, it's 59.6%. So it's large shares of the of employment is in agriculture. And you can also download the data for industry. And so in China, it's 22.5%. In India, it's 16.3%. So you look at these numbers, and before you look at the results, you'd say you'd expect, well, first you'd expect both countries to behave similarly. But if anything, you'd expect the Lewis effect to dominate. Well, you'd expect the Lewis effect to be stronger in India, right? So those are kind of the results that you'd expect before you look at these results. So in that sense, I thought it was a little puzzling, the results that they got. Now, so so then I was just thinking about, okay, so how to think about this? Well, I think to some extent there's a certain tension here in the sense that I think it's really nice that you're looking at China and India. I think that's a really nice part of the paper. But at the same time, I also think that it's a little difficult for a simple model to be able to account for the differences between these two countries, because clearly there's going to be lots of things that you can't incorporate in the model. So I was just thinking about, okay, so how do you approach this? And so one of the things I was thinking about was, and this so this is already, by the way, some empirical analysis you already have in the paper, is just focusing a little bit more on the within country heterogeneity. I thought that was I think that would be really interesting in the fact that the sense that if you think about India, you think about China, these are really large countries, big heterogeneity within the countries, and there's no reason to think that within the Lewis effect dominates in India, or Melitz effect dominates in India, and Lewis effect dominates in China. Whereas you could even expect, for example, maybe within India, Melitz effect may dominate in some regions and Lewis effect dominating in others. So I think that within country heterogeneity would be a really cool area to explore in that sense. So the way I think about it is more just and you already have some of this analysis. I'm going to show it on the next slide. Is focusing more on some of that empirical analysis that you've been doing, in which you look at the within country variation. There's some regions with this initially high agricultural employment, and comparing it to the results with the low agricultural employment share. So I think that would be a really neat area to proceed in that sense. So here I copied your table 4 from the paper. It's table 6 in the presentation. So this is just going to be the baseline results. So this is going to be the results for India and China, except that here you've divided up so each one of these columns is a diff and diff specification, and so here you've just divided it up into regions that had low agricultural employment, medium, and large, and then here you see exactly this kind of pattern, which is going to be, you tend to see that in regions with larger share of employment in the agricultural sector in the year 2000, they also tend to see stronger Lewis effects, which is going to be what's predicted by the theory. So in that sense, I think looking at this within country heterogeneity would be a cool way to proceed in terms of the empirical analysis. Okay, and then two more. Well, I'll start with the second one. I thought, I think I'm not going to have time to talk about the first. I'll just talk about the second. So another one that I think, so something else I think too that would be useful to address in the paper is just how to think about services in India. And the reason why I say this is because if you look at tables 1 through 3, I'm suspecting that there's something going on with services here. So let me walk you through this. So if you look at, well, at least in the case of India, so if you look at table 1, in the treated areas, there's the number of manufacturing establishments declines. And then in table 2, if you look at that table, the average employees per establishment, that's remaining unchanged. So it's statistically insignificant. So, you combine table 1 and 2, you could say, well, it seems like there's a decline in the employment in the manufacturing sector. And then if you look at table 3, you say, well, where are these workers going? Well, if you look at table 3, the total agricultural employment's remaining unchanged in the area. So doesn't seem like they're going to agriculture. So it seems like the service sector is going to be, there's some margin of adjustment here that's happening through the service sector. So I think that would be something useful to address in the paper. Maybe I've got another minute, so I'll just do the first point here. And so this came up during some of the questions, which is going to be that so one of the assumptions of the model is you're really having the local economy have a comparative advantage in this manufacturing good. But if you think about, okay, so in some ways it's a little odd to think about every region in the economy having the same comparative advantage. So I think it'd be good to just derive the results for the opposite case, and then just see how it would fit in with the empirical work. I think that would be helpful to do as well. Okay, so I am running out of time, so I'll just go ahead and conclude. It's a really nice paper in the sense that it's combining these insights from trade and the literature and structural transformation, has some nice empirical work on China and India, which is cool, being able to look at these two big economies, and look forward to seeing future iterations of the paper. Thank you.
guess we can collect a few questions. Well, let me ask you. So I guess there are like something you could explore in the empirics as well. So I guess the model doesn't only have implications about the initial level of agriculture, but also about the change, like how strong is structural change implied by the model, and just look at that in the data, as opposed to only the initial level, just to reinforce the fact that more structural change is coming along with the number of establishments.
Data, and there's easier data usually on GDP, agricultural production, and the model makes predictions on all of those. So it would be just good to, rather than just having this one output, and then all the production and labor reallocation in the background, to just document.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I just want to ask about whether you paid any attention to the differences between India and China in terms of labor mobility, both spatially, but also across sectors, because we know that the Hogeun system restricted mobility for some workers, and that was playing a big role. And then in India we have also incentives to not hire. That restrict the growth of firms in terms of hiring more because of more restrictive labor laws. And also we do have subsidies in agriculture, and also in services that are discouraging movement across district lines, because those benefits are payable only when the worker or the farmer stays in that district. So I just want to understand how these very different settings are affecting your results.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for the constructive comments. And also, I totally agree with your suggestions that in addition to the initial agriculture share, we can also look at the empirical results with respect to the changes in agriculture employment. And we will certainly look at more outcomes in addition to the number of businesses once we get access, once we collect the data. And thank you very much for bringing up this aspect of labor migration laws. We are aware of that. So that's why we actually find the difference between China and labor results a little bit puzzling, because we thought maybe China has a more strict labor migration laws than India. But thank you also by telling us that India also has a labor migration laws across the state boundaries. So in our results, it can potentially slow down the structural transformation force, because now we assume that the workers can freely move between the sectors. But yes, we can potentially do some robustness checks and to see, if we look at within country heterogeneities across regions, maybe, with different labor migration flows, labor migration patterns, then whether our results are robust.
So your agricultural sector is the import competing sector always in the model, right? So then your manufacturing is a net export sector. That would not be consistent with what is true of India, right? So does that kind of make any does that kind of create any problems in making tying it to the data from India? And secondly, also I couldn't see anything in the model that'll, given that the manufacturing sector is the net export sector and the agricultural sector is always the import competing sector, so the net import sector. There was nothing to ensure trade balance. Maybe I missed something. So is trade balance guaranteed in your model?
Any other questions? The last question.
All right. So from the elegance of the model, I understand why we talk about the number of firms, right?
from an academic perspective, very interesting to look at those opposing forces. But earlier today, we had a lot of presentations that were talking about employment moving to small firms, but not really trading. So from a policy perspective, there are bigger questions that you might be able to answer with your data, right? To talk about what does this mean for productivity. It's not per se clear whether a larger number of firms is actually welfare improving, or it might actually harm productivity trends in the countries. So I feel also, because we're like, this is a World Bank conference, like we are all interested, like, okay, so what does this mean, right? So do we see diverging trends in India and China in terms of how productivity, how exports develop based on the trends that you observe? Thank you. So like, can you explore on the policy recommendations based on your research?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, we are aware that India is the net agricultural exporters, and we think that's maybe a potential reason why the structural transformation force is weaker in India, because they are actually exporting agricultural goods to the rest of the world. So when the trade costs decrease, there's also an increase in the demand for their agricultural products, right? So that again keep people in the agricultural sector. So that could be a potential explanation for the difference in the results between China and India. And about the trade balance, so in our model, the price of goods from the rest of the world is exogenous. So that's why the rest of the world will just take up whatever goods that's selling to them. Yeah. So it's a small open economy model. And thank you for the question about the policy implications. So yeah, so in the interest of time, I didn't mention that so in our model, the trade will always improve welfare, no matter whether it increase the number of business or decrease the number of business, because it lowers the prices of the non-agricultural goods. But the two channels have different predictions on the distribution of income. So if you look at the Melitz model, it lowering the trade costs will increase the wages for the workers. But if you are thinking about the structural transformation model, the wages will not change as long as there is people flowing out of agricultural sector. So in our model, we actually show that the profit to wage ratio is proportional to the number of people working in the non-agricultural sector. So when you have more people working in the non-agricultural sector, in our model, the profit to wage ratio decreases. So the gain of trade is accrued to the capital owners, but not to the workers. So I think that's the important policy implication of our model.
Great. I think we're done for the day. The dinner is at 6:30 at Rasika. So I guess we have like 15 minutes. We'll be there. Thank you.